Hey, so today I wanted to talk a bit about one of my favorite films, Juzo Itami's Tampopo. If you've ever heard the term spaghetti western for a cowboy movie shot in Italy, then you can think of Tampopo just as the film was often promoted, as the first ramen western. But to clarify, the film doesn't undertake every element of a cowboy flick. Rather, it's largely comprised of vignettes that are loosely related and interspersed within the main story skeleton of a western. A cowboy hat-wearing stranger rides into town, but the protagonist, Goro, drives a milk truck rather than riding a horse and leading cattle. In town, he finds his analog to a saloon, a noodle shop. He gets into a brawl there and has a love interest before riding again out of town. Before leaving, however, he helps out Tampopo, the noodle shop owner, to elevate her failing restaurant and perfect her cooking style. Food is the main theme of the vignettes. Here, a master's lesson on eating noodles. There, a grotesque pinching of fruit in a supermarket. A dying woman's last time cooking supper before she collapses, etc. Itami chooses each of these vignettes to capture the sensuality behind eating. Many scenes throbbing with sexual energy by the consumption of food. The typically noted scene being one in which a gangster cracks an egg into the mouth of his mistress, and the two erotically pass it between their mouths until the yolk breaks and suggestively runs out of the ecstatic mouth of the woman. So the main ideas for the film are food and sex. The Western narrative is, by Itami's own confession, just a neat satirical skeleton to hold together the fleshy vignettes. However, I find the comical mixture of the Eastern and Western within the film as bizarre enough to warrant an analysis unto itself. And I think that there's some meaning to the use of Westernisms and the Western film style. That is, cultural elements of Western civilization, and then the employment of the cowboy film tropes of Westerns in the film beyond its initial étonnement and novelty. Namely, as our Western-styled cowboy rides in and reforms a traditional Japanese noodle shop, and as the Japanese woman is earnest to take in these new skills and practice them to perfection, the film has a lot to offer about Japan and her cultural practice of foreign emulation. So in the brief time here, we'll look at a couple scenes and how Itami captures and evaluates Japanese imitation of the West. The storytelling medium of food proves to be a good lens through which aspects of Japan's interaction with foreign nations can be seen. Japan has had a long history of interacting with other nations and receiving foreign culture via these nations' cuisines. As Michael Ashkenazi recognizes, the Japanese taste has been expanding itself and, quote, welcoming new and foreign dishes since the first Korean and Chinese ambassadors and immigrants started arriving in the 6th century. The various foods that these outlanders, as well as subsequent waves of them, brought in have gone through a culinary digestion of sorts, and found themselves remaining in Japanese cuisine and culture. This process is referred to by Ashkenazi as Japanization. Japanization occurs, of course, in many realms beyond solely the culinary. Japan has found many desirable elements of other cultures, emulated them, and eventually modified them as necessary in order that they may most comfortably remain within the Japanese arsenal. Ashkenazi cites Buddhism, the court system, and even the written word as things that Japan has borrowed from its neighbors, and yet changed sufficiently that they may become uniquely Japanese mainstays. Just as one can clearly see, for example, the difference between Chinese characters and their Japanese counterparts, so too can one see the difference between a bowl of Japanese ramen and a bowl of ramen, its Chinese predecessor and edamame. But Japanese borrowing of food, etc., extends regionally beyond Asia and temporally into contemporary times. Japan has nowadays access to foods from all over the world. Because of the nature of the global marketplace and because of Japan's great economic success, and thence ability to take advantage of global resources and cuisine. But much of the Japanese stomach's interaction with global, and particularly Western, food begins in the 1980s. As Ashkenazi writes, the 1980s were economic boom years in Japan, and also when the term gourmet, or gourmet, became a prominent feature of social discourse. a time when luxury domestic and imported food items became commonplace in many households, and the Japanese sought not only to consume these new foreign luxury foods, but to do so properly and to understand, or at least engage more fully in the conspicuous consumption of, the culture whence they came. Courses in proper table etiquette and the pursuit and appreciation of fine food, drink, and dining became accessible to a wider audience than before, becoming a fashionable hobby. This is evidenced in Tampopo in two scenes in Western restaurants that will be discussed later, one with young girls receiving a lesson in proper Western table etiquette, and another wherein businessmen indulge and perform the theatrics of their hobby of Western gourmet. It's with the cultural relevance of food in Japan in the 1980s that Tampopo sets its themes as such. With such a rich Japanese interest in international culture, Itami is able to use the various foods and their eaters in Tampopo as representatives for Japan's larger relationship with the world. Gourmet activities are linked to Japan's economic success. The film Tampopo thus purposefully lacks Japan's culinary staple of rice and hallmark hobbies such as tea ceremonies in order to show the country not as a stereotype based on outward image and predictable hierarchy, but rather as a product of its own people, who have stepped into another generation and have different cultural dispositions nowadays. In short, Tampopo finds itself in the realm of the gourmet because that is what people in Japan were into at the time. The plot of the main story presents a parallel with Japan's cultural relationships and tendency towards a discipleship. We may consider the main goal of our main character simply to be the pursuit of perfect ramen. For these Japanese characters, ramen is an interesting choice of culinary pursuit. Ramen is a dish that is strongly associated with Japan. The dish seems to be typical Japanese food and to represent something about Japan. Its origins, however, are in China, and despite the co-optation of the dish into the Japanese milieu within Japan, quoting Katharina Hoff in The Colonial Noodle Soup, ramen still maintains its Chinese identity, insofar as that cultural association persists in addition to the categorization under Chinese-style noodles. The Chinese identity of the dish is displayed in the scene with the ramen master. Although the men in this scene are both Japanese, when you look at the bowl, you see that the bowl is very Chinese, decorated with large Chinese characters and Chinese-style dragons. This scene comes very near the beginning of the film and establishes the themes of ramen and discipleship. The ramen master scene is presented as a story within the story, a book which sidekick Gun reads to a very interested Goro in the truck. A young man details an important episode in his life story, his discipleship under a man who has studied noodles for 40 years. First, observe the whole bowl, appreciate its gestalt, savor the aromas. The master goes on to describe to the young man the beauty of the bowl, how to properly appreciate and respect it, and the order in which each constituent part ought to be eaten. The young man carefully listens to his master's admonition, hangs on to each detail of how the soup is to be eaten. The young man does not, however, seem to apply much skepticism to these seemingly eccentric instructions. He instructs, then poke the pork. Just touch it. Caress it with chopstick tips. Gently pick it up and dip it into the soup on the right of the bowl. What's important here is to apologize to the pork by saying, "See you soon." It's at this point that Gun, dressed in Western style with his blue jeans, t-shirt, and bandana, stops reading to scoff at the old man's foolishness. The young man in the story, however, finds no reason to doubt his master. Rather, he listens intently. Why? Because the master knows what he's talking about. This is a man who spent 40 years studying noodles. If anyone would know the proper way to eat them, it would be he. The young man recognizes this authority and will not allow his preconceptions to eschew it. In his assiduity to his master's lesson, the young man thus begins an important theme in Tampopo. The film portrays in various incarnations the relationship between teacher and student. This relationship has an important place in the Japanese psyche. It evokes any of the various stereotypical images of the Japanese. A diligent school student under his teacher, one seeking to learn a martial art from his sensei, etc. But another important example of this relationship in Japan manifests itself on an international level. This discipleship would be the various ways in which Japan has, as a country on the international stage, adapted and survived through the inception and emulation of the knowledge and policies of more established national powers, or made itself a student of other nations. In Japan Rising, Kenneth B. Pyle links Japan's national practice of emulating strong nations to her psychic attitude towards discipleship. Quote, "The readiness to emulate the institutions of the strong bred of the traditional Japanese attitude toward learning, which entailed a long apprenticeship in which one meticulously followed the practices of the master." Itami makes such style of learning a theme in his film and illuminates the similarity between personal and national learning. The Ramen master scene, thus, sets the stage for discipleship and serves the historical purpose of Japan's emulation of the East before we meet the main story's treatment of Japan's emulation of the West. Ramen is, again, a food that has been imported from China and only recently become a Japanese typicality. How the eager young Japanese man diligently watches and studies the foodstuff lying in an emphatically Chinese bowl can be considered to be parallel to how Japan learned from and emulated the national strengths of China. It's also important to consider the framing of this scene within the film. Gunn reads us this scene. That this scene is being accounted from a written down form means that it has already happened and necessitates its chronological precedence. The two Western-dressed men reading the story, then, are the present. They represent the modern reality that Japan emulates the West. Just as he hears the story of the master helping a student to eat ramen the proper and learned way, Goro himself will go on to help his future student Tampopo make optimal ramen. The young man studying under the ramen master is Tampopo's spiritual ancestor. They both represent Japan in a particular era. The ramen master is China, whom Japan used to emulate, and Goro is the West, whom Japan now essays to emulate. Outside of the main story, the vignettes in Tampopo also portray discipleship in Japanese society. The various students and teachers here also go beyond the persons themselves. They're a medium for social commentary, and themselves a microcosm for the learning that goes on at the international level. Two scenes that I would like to examine for the nature of their student-teacher relationships both occur in a Western restaurant in Japan, and involve Japanese people navigating the strange culture they find there within. A group of businessmen sit themselves down for lunch. The waiter approaches the eldest amongst them first, and finds two men who cannot read French. Then, another senior businessman orders the sole meunier, consommé, and a Heineken. A curious choice, curious but unquestioned, however, as everyone else, asked in descending hierarchical order, follows his suit and orders what he has. Sole meunier, consommé, Heineken. Sole meunier, consommé, Heineken. Then the waiter arrives at the last man at the table, a man with his feet still on the ground of the corporate ladder, who carried in everyone's briefcases and awkwardly dropped them earlier. The waiter is surprised by his thoughtful reading of the menu. Then, despite the warning kicks under the table from a superior, the young man proceeds to have a conversation with the waiter, wherein he displays his culinary knowledge and upstages everyone at the table. The surprise protagonist in this scene is none of the people who would traditionally have the most power in Japanese society, but rather the one who is lowest on the totem pole among these businessmen, by virtue of his excellence in that so Japanese value of learning and exercising another culture's particular strength. We have another instance of young versus old with the manor schoolgirls and their instructress. This scene takes, however, a marked difference from the scene with the businessmen in the nature of the majority, where, in the previous scene, the single young man was lauded as he stood against an overwhelming majority and a tradition of rigidity among his older masters. In this corner of the French restaurant, the tables are turned. A group of Japanese girls from a manor school are having a lesson in a Western-style restaurant. They have plates of spaghetti before them. The, also Japanese instructress, teaches them how to twirl the spaghetti with the fork and put it into the spoon. In eating the spaghetti, she warns, one is to make no noise. She relays, in the West, unlike in Japan, it is taboo to make such noise while eating noodles. She looks sharply at those girls who slurp a little as they eat. they're having trouble eating silently. The instructress tries ultimately to no avail to whip her younger students into shape. She pursues, in fact, the usually lauded and proper goal of westernization. She attempts, namely, to silence her students while eating spaghetti, a point she makes in contrast to the traditional Japanese fashion of eating noodles, which is to slurp loudly as a show of appreciation and to declare the tastiness of the food. Her idea is that the proper European fashion assumes a measure of repression and results in a silent consumption of pasta. Her folly, however, is hinted at by the young girl's gradual resistance to lesson and is fully displayed by the white Westerner across from the group who is happily slurping up his own spaghetti and interrupting the lesson with the sounds thereof. At the end of the lesson, then, the defeated instructress gives in. All the girls and she herself are slurping away at their plates of spaghetti. She tries to restrain her students in the name of emulation of the West, but that emulation proved not to be authentic enough to warrant the desired transformation. Like the businessman, the instructress pursued an emulation of the West, and also like the businessman, this emulation proved itself to be only superficial. The superficiality seems to be the only thing against which Itami's mores are diametrically opposed. There are two ways which we can reason this contempt for superficiality and emulation of the West: individualism and efficiency. The former is the more Dionysian appeal of the criticism. It is concerned with the repression that takes place during a superficial emulation. This on-the-surface mode of ordered behavior would seem to go against human nature and cage the beast in an unnatural way. The girls from the manor school, for example, felt somehow wrong that they tried to refrain from making noise, felt as though they were holding themselves back, and found it difficult spiritually to conform to that way of being. The mentality behind this also highlights the virtue of human ingenuity in standing out from the crowd, so the suppression of these qualities is seen as an injustice. The youngest of the businessmen, for example, would have erred if he had restrained himself and held his tongue when he ordered, for favor of whatever sycophantic benefit would be due, conforming to the superficiality of his seniors. But he was praised by this ethic of individualism for that he resisted that sycophantry and instead put his individual style on full display and exercised his own personal excellence to its fullest. The latter and Apollonian aspect of why it's wrong to emulate superficially is predicated upon efficiency. Fault can be found with a merely superficial emulation on practical grounds. Tracing back Japan's legacy of cultural emulation, the practical benefits come with a diligent pursuit and thorough execution of emulation. This goes back to Japan's historical period of the Meiji Restoration, when Japan set its sight on competence in the international stage. But this competence was taken to mean survival. According to Kenneth Pyle, they understood international relations as jakuniku kyoshoku, that the strong devour the weak, and knew that, quote, the state that failed to be socialized into the prevailing norms of this new order might be deprived of its very existence. This pursuit of well-executed emulation, then, was of high priority. More superficial emulation would, of course, have certainly diffused along with these more substantial ones, but historically would have been useless before the more functional elements, technology, industry, advancements in warfare, etc., from the West, and even rioting and court systems much earlier from China. Keeping in mind the ethos of efficiency, let us consider the French restaurant as an Western embassy of sorts. Within this embassy, the Japanese visitors would act then as ambassadors. Let's say ambassadors in the Meiji period going out to learn as much as possible for the purposes of emulation of a strong power for their country. Their mission is as simple as that of any other ambassador, to make one's country look good before another and to curry maximal favor with the latter. In this paradigm, we may assess the successfulness of the businessman. The winner among them is clearly the young man who woos the waiter with his real, internal, substantial knowledge of Western cuisine. If these men were ambassadors in the Meiji Restoration, the young man would give the best political performance and would be the most lauded and rewarded for his efforts upon returning home. His eschewal of Japan's traditional priority of hierarchical piety might be excused because his superiors are acting inefficiently and in a very unsuccessful way. The situation is the same with the young majority, of the manor school girls. Their mutiny against their instructor is not wrong because she is so misguided and impractical. The Westerner among them is the prime example of Western manner, and so he is the logical choice for emulation, instead of the Japanese woman who is incorrectly appropriating a superficial aspect of Western culture out of her own arbitration. One very comical scene in the film takes place in a supermarket, that most deeply Western of spaces, in Japan, and follows two characters therein, an elderly woman and the younger shopkeeper. This scene would seem to suggest an abandonment of elderly wisdom in Japan, motivated, respecting the setting, through the instatement of Western cultural elements. The Japan might be losing respect for their elders somewhere within the aisles of the supermarket. In a sense, it provides an echo from the French restaurant scene, but seems to take a different attitude. In the French restaurant scene, the ingenuity of youth is praised over the rigidity of old age. However, here in the supermarket, there seems to be a greater measure of sympathy for the elderly. The old lady is shown sympathetically, in that her struggle is odd and troublesome. But that begs the question of how this old lady fell into the position of having to be troublesome and odd. What possesses this old lady to sneak around the supermarket and defile a peach and some camembert with her thumbs? The frustrated store clerk doesn't bother himself to pose this question, as he simply chases her away with a broom. Michael Ashkenazi proposes that the old lady struggles within the reality of a graying Japan. She wishes then to squeeze the fresh, luscious, ripe foods until they are as careworn and used as she is herself. Zvika Serper, watching the same scene, prefers rather to look at the peach. The humble, abused fruit is taken by Serper as a highly sexual object, which represents either the male or the female genitalia, rather both. The old woman strokes the pointed end of the perhaps phallic peach until juice squirts out of it in an ejaculation, and in the next shot, the peach is shown with its seam affront and softly penetrated as juice trickles from it, being here, of course, the female genitalia. Elsewhere, the peach is considered for its vulviformity and taken yet further. Amiko Onioki Turney, in her article, The Ambivalent Self of the Contemporary Japanese, recognizes the peach as a common symbol for the pedendum in Japan, but focuses less on the sexuality and more on all the properties of reproduction and rejuvenation owed to it. She then brings in a more recherché association with Japanese mythology, invoking the hero Momotaro, a hero who, in line with the folk myth tradition, was born of a peach. With all these associations in mind, and these various merits owed to the peach, the Western-dressed old woman's bruising of the fruit seems to have national implications, with the ruining of the peach then tantamount to the ruining of the Japanese folk spirit and virtue, the Japanese people themselves all the while too busy imitating the West to notice. In any case, the actions of the shopkeeper are certainly a marked departure from the discipleship we see elsewhere in the film. But the attitude motivating him is not altogether different. He is, like other students, a pragmatist. As the other students do not mind behearing and respecting their masters, submitting themselves to someone from whom they can learn and withdraw some practical good, so too does the shopkeeper orient himself. But he does not wish to waste his time in conversation with this old lady. Her perceived worthlessness is predicated upon that she has nothing of value to teach. She's outdated. It's not enough to be old, one must be wise. Wisdom, furthermore, is not liberally defined. The wisdom needs to be applicable to a practical gain. This can perhaps be perceived as a step away from the traditional values of Japan, notably a focus on the family. This departure from the family is an echo of the Meiji period. In that high period of emulation, what had been Japan's traditional family orientation was viewed by some as detrimental to the good of the nation. Meiji thought, to quote Pyle, blamed the family for destroying the spirit of individual initiative and independence upon which, they believed, modern scientific civilization depended. With this scene, then, we can see the nature of Japan's emulation of the West, what it pursues and what it leaves behind. We've looked at several scenes from Juzo Itami's Tampopo and discussed the role of the student-teacher relationship in them. Discipleship in Tampopo can be interpreted as representative and microcosmic of Japan's international relations. The The choice of ramen as the star is significant because ramen is a food that was not originally Japanese, but rather brought in Japan and has become typically Japanese. This non-Japanese origin of the food is demonstrated in the ramen master scene through the Chineseness of its bowl, and the study of this dish parallels Japan's emulation of China. The film's main chronology is after the ramen master scene, and the main student-teacher pair become Tampopo and Goro. The cowboy hat-wearing Goro represents the West that Tampopo, or modern Japan, emulates. Itami also looks at various aspects and incarnations of cultural emulation and evaluates them on their effectiveness. In the French restaurant scene, emulation is being poorly executed. The one student who is studied thoroughly then breaks through the mistake of his masters in the names both of practicality and individuality, and pursues excellence of his own accord. Then, the manor schoolgirls find themselves in a similar situation, when their master proves to have an imperfect and only superficial understanding of the culture to be emulated, and they instead pursue the direct model of the West across from them. Later on, the shopkeeper also chooses to forego whatever lessons the old woman has to teach, and instead accepts her troublesomeness and worthlessness without doubt. These students all have practicality in mind. The trends largely embody the goal of the student learning from the master and ultimately surpassing him. It also echoes a goal of the Meiji period, when Japan as a nation tried to emulate Western superpowers for the primary purpose of being strong enough ultimately to resist them. Thus, all the food imagery in the film is made during Japan's economic boom of luxury foods. And once our heroine Tampopo perfects her ramen, her cowboy instructor rides off to another town.